The following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well-being.
Hello and welcome. You're watching News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. Let's get you all the top national and international stories that we're tracking at this hour. Let's begin with the Israel-Hamas war, which has now entered its 55th day. Let's get you a complete lowdown. Well, Israel's military has announced that the temporary truce with Hamas will continue in light of the mediators' efforts to continue the process of getting hostages released. 16 hostages were released in the 6th batch of hostage swap on Wednesday. This latest swap included 12 Israelis and 4 Thai nationals. 30 Palestinian prisoners were also freed. These were 16 minors and 14 women. Hamas has said what is being proposed to extend the truce is not the best. In total, 70 Israelis and 210 Palestinian prisoners have been released so far. Also, more than 1,400 aid trucks have been let into Gaza since the truce came into effect. According to the Hamas-run health ministry, more than 14,800 Palestinians have been killed in the Israeli offensive since the 7th of October. More than 6,000 of these were children. The Palestinian Red Cross Society has also delivered several trucks of aid into Gaza in the past 24 hours. Israel's military has announced that the truce with Hamas will continue for at least another day. The decision is based on ongoing mediation efforts to facilitate the release of the remaining hostages contingent upon the terms of the existing agreement. As of now, Hamas has not commented on this. The extension of the ceasefire in Gaza, initially set to conclude at 7 a.m. local time, follows the recent exchange of 16 Hamas-held hostages for 30 Palestinian prisoners, which took place on Wednesday night. Henry Kissinger, a diplomatic powerhouse whose roles as a national security advisor and Secretary of State under 2 U.S. presidents left an indelible mark on American foreign policy and earned him a controversial Nobel Peace Prize, died on Wednesday at the age of 100. Here's a look at the life and times of Henry Kissinger.
American diplomat and Nobel Peace Prize winner Henry Kissinger died Wednesday at his home in Connecticut. He was 100 years old. Kissinger was active late in life. He recently published a book on leadership styles and earlier this year visited Beijing to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping. Kissinger was born in Germany in 1923 and moved to the United States with his family in his teens before the Holocaust. Kissinger earned his doctorate from Harvard University in 1954 and remained on the faculty there for the next 17 years, during which he regularly consulted government agencies on diplomatic affairs. Republican President Richard Nixon first brought Kissinger to the White House as a national security advisor and later named him Secretary of State. Kissinger had a hand in many global events in the 70s, including the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, a long and bloody process punctuated by massive U.S. bombing of North Vietnam and Cambodia. Kissinger's 1973 Peace Prize was one of the most controversial ever, with 2 members of the Nobel Committee resigning over the selection when questions arose about the U.S.'s secret bombing campaigns in Southeast Asia. Kissinger's diplomatic efforts led to the opening of China, landmark U.S.-Soviet arms control talks, and expanded ties between Israel and its Arab neighbors. He became famous for his highly personal, high-pressure brand of shuttle diplomacy, and was widely hailed for his brilliance and broad experience. Others branded Kissinger a war criminal for his support of anti-communist dictatorships, especially in Latin America. Kissinger's days in the suites of power largely came to an end with the election of Democrat Jimmy Carter in 1976. After leaving government, Kissinger set up a consulting firm in New York, which offered advice to the world's corporate elite. He served on company boards and various foreign policy and security forums, wrote books, and became a regular media commentator on international affairs. Kissinger is survived by his second wife, Nancy, and 2 children from his first marriage.
Henry Kissinger, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and influential figure in American foreign policy, passed away on Wednesday at his Connecticut home. This was confirmed by Kissinger associates. Diplomatic activities right till the very end, including attending White House meetings, publishing a book on leadership and providing testimony on North Korea's nuclear threat before a Senate committee. Kissinger had a hand in many epoch-changing global events of the 1970s, including the Vietnam War, the diplomatic opening of China, the landmark US-Soviet arms control talks, and expanded ties between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Kissinger has been considered to be the first American official to enter China since 1949. His secret trip to China in 1971 changed the face of US-China ties. US diplomatic ties with China were a significant hallmark of the Nixon presidency, and Kissinger's secret trip resulted in Nixon's presidential trip to China the following year in 1972. This trip was possible as the US kept sending feelers to China through Pakistan. Kissinger chose 3 people to go to China with him on a secret trip. The US administration made an announcement that he would visit Vietnam, Thailand, India and Pakistan. The game plan was to go off secretly to Beijing via Pakistan. He pleaded illness and said he was going to a Pakistani hill station to recuperate. However, Kissinger came down with a real stomach ache when in India. He left for China from Pakistan when he was not well. In China, the US group discussed with Zhou Enlai for 17 hours, and China invited President Richard Nixon to visit the country, which changed the Cold War era history. Let's now take a look at Kissinger's role in Vietnam. Kissinger had been one of the most powerful national security advisors of the United States. He was accused of prolonging the Vietnam War by influencing US policies in the Indo-China region. During Kissinger's tenure, the US dropped 9 billion pounds of ammunition in Indochina. In 1971, Kissinger had secret meetings with Vietnam's Le Duc Tho. The meetings eventually led to the Paris Peace Accords. These peace accords called for an end to the US involvement in Vietnam. Kissinger managed to withdraw more than 500,000 US troops out of Vietnam. However, the peace accord collapsed and South Vietnam government with it. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, which is considered very controversial till date. His detractors say he only led Southeast Asia into further turmoil. Henry Kissinger played a pivotal role in shaping the geopolitical landscape during the India-Pakistan War as well. America was caught in a flummox when the India-Pakistan War began, as China was backing Pakistan and the Soviets were backing India. The US cut aid to India and, as a warning, sent the 17th Fleet to the Bay of Bengal. The Soviets, in response, deployed their cruisers and submarines to contain the US aggression. Declassified documents added another layer and exposed Kissinger's efforts to navigate the intricate web of alliances and interests, including his attempts to maintain a delicate balance between supporting Pakistan and avoiding a direct confrontation with India. Kissinger engaged in back-channel diplomacy with the leaders of both India and Pakistan. However, the creation of Bangladesh in 1971 with India's help is seen as one of the weak points of Kissinger's diplomacy. News from Nepal now. A gay couple in the country on Wednesday became the first in Nepal to receive official same-sex marriage status. The Himalayan nation is one of the first in Asia to allow same-sex marriage. This comes 5 months after the Supreme Court of Nepal issued an interim order clearing the way for such marriages in the largely conservative society. The marriage took place between 36-year-old Ram Bahadur Gurung, who was born male but identifies as female, and Surendra Pandey, 26, who identifies as male. Sunil Babu Pant, an openly gay former parliamentarian and leading LGBTQ rights activist, has said that after 23 years of struggle, Nepal has got this historic achievement, and finally Maya and Surinder got their marriage registered. Lots of participants held up placards while taking part in a gay pride parade to mark the month in Kathmandu. Donald Trump embraced the 6 January rioters, calling them patriots, and then went on to assure potential pardons if re-elected to office. His legal team, which is preparing for the upcoming 4th March hearing, is trying to distance Trump from the rioters and frame them as independent actors. Special counsel Jack Smith argued that Trump is responsible for the Capitol Hill chaos that took place that day, emphasizing on his supportive rhetoric for those rioters, while Trump has denied wrongdoing and called the case against him politically motivated. Separate civil cases assess his liability for the Capitol Hill attack. The trial's outcome may hinge on defense strategy to minimize links between Trump and the rioters. Over 800 have pleaded guilty or have been convicted, with 2/3 sentenced to prison term, as Trump's rhetoric remains a political focal point in the US. Building on Ukraine's battlefield and political achievements was a focus for the NATO meeting in Brussels. Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron spoke to the media during his arrival for the second day of the NATO Foreign Ministers Summit and added concrete steps were needed to help Ukraine fight Russia, which invaded that country in February of 2022.
Two weeks ago, I was in Ukraine saying we needed to do everything that we could to help the Ukrainians repel this appalling aggression by Putin. And I'll be building consensus for that view here at NATO today. When you look at the big picture, what's happened recently is the Ukrainians have pushed the Russian Navy right back across the Black Sea. They've opened a shipping lane to get their exports out. Their economy is growing. And of course, they're knocking on the door of both NATO and the EU and getting a very warm response. These are huge achievements, and our job today is to build on those achievements and work out what other concrete steps we can take to help the Ukrainians in their struggle and to show that Russian aggression must never pay.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg warned on Wednesday that Russia has amassed large missile stockpile ahead of the winter. He stressed that Russia had been making new attempts to strike Ukraine's power grid and energy infrastructure.
Russia has amassed a large missile stockpile ahead of winter, and we see new attempts to strike Ukraine's power grid and energy infrastructure, trying to leave Ukraine in the dark and cold. Russia is also becoming much more dependent on China. Year by year, Moscow is mortgaging its future to Beijing. Militarily, Russia has lost a substantial part of its conventional forces. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of tanks, and more than 300,000 casualties.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Wednesday that there was no sense of fatigue amongst NATO allies when it came to helping Ukraine. He said, and I quote, "We must and we will continue to support Ukraine." He said this after a NATO-Ukraine meeting in Brussels. Listen in.
First, we focused on NATO's enduring support and commitment to Ukraine. And I have to tell you, listening to all of our colleagues around the table, every single one expressed strong, enduring support for Ukraine. Some are questioning whether the United States and other NATO allies should continue to stand with Ukraine as we enter the second winter of Putin's brutality. But the answer here today at NATO is clear and it's unwavering. We must and we will continue to support Ukraine. I heard no sense of fatigue or falling back. On the contrary, a determination to continue to press forward. And there's a good reason for that. I think every ally recognizes that this is a matter not only of doing the right thing, it's a matter of self-interest, including for the United States.
The Kremlin, commenting on media reports that Poland plans to send troops to Finland's border with Russia, has said such a move could stoke tensions and that Russia would see it as a threat. The head of Poland's National Security Bureau was reported to have said this the week that Warsaw planned to approve a Finnish request for troops to be deployed close to its border with Russia.
Well, there is no conflict as such. Firstly, nothing, and no one is threatening Finland. And in this case, this is, of course, an absolutely redundant measure to ensure border security, because there is no threat there. In reality, there is no tension. Tension may actually arise during the concentration of additional units on our border, because the Finns must be clearly aware that this will pose a threat to us. An increase in the concentration of military units on our borders. Therefore, this is a completely unprovoked, unjustified concentration of armed units on the Russian border.
Japan has asked the US to suspend all non-emergency V-22 Osprey flights over its territory following a fatal incident where one of the aircraft fell into the sea in western Japan on Wednesday. This marks Japan's first fatal US military plane crash in 5 years. This comes within days of the Japanese Coast Guard reporting that a US military V-22 Osprey aircraft crashed near an island in western Japan with 8 people on board. The crash on Wednesday killed at least 1 person and the condition of the other 7 is still unknown. The tilt-rotor plane, which can fly both like a helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft, is operated by the US Marines, US Navy and the Japan Self-Defense Forces. The Osprey has witnessed numerous accidents over the last few years. The Japan Self-Defense Forces will suspend flights of the Osprey until the circumstances of the incident are clarified, according to a statement that was issued by the Defense Ministry in Parliament. The Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary updated the media about the crash. Listen in.
Today at around 2:40 p.m., we received information that a US military Osprey disappeared from radar off the coast of Yakushima in Kagoshima Prefecture. Along with confirming the severity of injuries, rescue efforts are the highest priority for the government.
The Election Commission of Pakistan is facing accusations of using a controversial exercise to redraw the voting map in order to favour the return of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to power. This allegation comes amid accusations of pre-poll rigging and increasing doubts over the fairness of the upcoming general elections in that country. The process of amending the constituency borders, known as delimitation, follows on from a census that was recently undertaken, which was marred by controversies. A record 1,300 objections were raised across the country over the proposed changes to constituencies by the Election Commission, including over the merging of the Baluchistan districts of Harnai and Sibi into a single constituency, despite them being 400 kilometers apart with no road connections and stark climate, culture and demographic differences. The 2018 elections in Pakistan brought Imran Khan, a prominent former cricketer turned politician, to power after Nawaz Sharif's departure. However, Khan was ousted in April 2022 via a no-confidence vote and is currently serving a 3-year prison sentence on corruption charges. Despite his incarceration, Khan remains a leading opposition figure, with his party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, maintaining substantial support among the electorate. The United Arab Emirates is likely to invest anywhere between $20 and $25 billion in financially strained Pakistan through a series of agreements. The signing ceremony followed discussions between caretaker Prime Minister Anwarul Haq Kakar and UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The MOUs encompass collaborative investments spanning various sectors, including energy, port operations, food security, mining, aviation and banking. This financial influx is a welcome development for Pakistan, which has been grappling with a steadily deteriorating economy, acute balance of payments challenges and diminishing foreign exchange reserves. During the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Kakar and Sheikh Mohammed, attended by Army Chief General Syed Asim Munir, both leaders expressed their commitment to enhancing strategic cooperation and dialogue between the two sides. Prime Minister Kakar extended his gratitude to the UAE's leadership for unwavering support in the economic and financial domains. From a fresh alert on the perils of artificial intelligence to Russia's ambition to compete with Western technology, here's a look at some of the major stories of the week in the AI revolution.
From an extinction warning for humans to what Vladimir Putin thinks about artificial intelligence, this is Generation AI. OpenAI staff warned the company's board of a breakthrough in tech that could endanger humanity. That's according to Reuters sources. Details of the warning remain unknown, but it was reportedly a key development ahead of boss Sam Altman's brief ousting from the company. Vladimir Putin says the West can't be allowed a monopoly on AI. The Russian president says his country must massively scale up its supercomputing capacity and said a new national AI strategy would soon be agreed. But observers say Moscow is hindered by sanctions and an outflow of tech talent following the conflict in Ukraine. NVIDIA appears to have delayed the launch of new AI chips for China. They're supposed to get around US controls on the exports of the most cutting-edge silicon. But Reuters sources say the products are delayed, potentially creating an opportunity for Chinese rivals like Huawei. Amazon has unveiled its own chip aimed at cloud computing applications. It's designed to train AI systems and is said to be 4 times faster than an earlier version. The move steps up rivalry with Microsoft, which unveiled its own custom silicon just weeks ago. The US, UK, and more than a dozen other countries unveiled a plan to keep AI safe from rogue actors. Critics say the agreement isn't binding, and it's full of general recommendations like keeping AI safe from abuse. But US regulators say it's important that so many nations have committed to putting safety first.
As Russia issues warnings about the escalating threat of a nuclear war and diplomatic ties with the US deteriorating, communities residing near the expansive Soviet-era nuclear testing site in northern Kazakhstan have a crucial message for world leaders. Here's a report.
This barren steppe in northern Kazakhstan was once the theatre of devastating nuclear tests, causing radiation that impacted the local environment and people's health. As Russia warns of the rising risk of a nuclear war and relations with the United States sink to a deep freeze, communities close to the vast Soviet-era nuclear testing site have a message for leaders. Serik Bey Yibrai is a local leader in the village of Sarizol. He saw tests being carried out just miles away when he was a boy.
We are the people who have witnessed the consequences of the nuclear test site. If the countries resume nuclear tests, if this is going to repeat itself, the population of the world would be killed. Let our sufferings teach others a lesson. It's necessary to convey our distress to other people. If this resumes, then humankind will disappear.
Between 1949 and 1989, hundreds of nuclear tests were carried out near Samey, a town close to the Kazakh-Russian border. When devices detonated above ground, authorities ordered locals out of homes and schools because of fears that ground tremors might cause buildings to collapse. Baglan Gabulin lives in Kainar, another village that lived under the shadow of nuclear testing.
Я помню, маленький лет, где-то мне 5 было.
I remember I was 5 years old. I was very young. We were told training was supposed to take place. At a certain point in time, leave the house and do not look towards the Degelin mountain. But we were young and curious, so we looked in that direction. First came a yellow flash and a black mushroom after it. The adults tried to drive us away.
While villages such as Kainar and Sarizol were exposed to direct radiation, Step winds carried nuclear fallout across an area the size of Italy. The effect of the radiation continues to affect lives there. Umed Bebasheva, also from Kenya, says her sister was seriously impacted by the nuclear tests.
This is my sister, Saule Bebasheva. She was born in 1961. At school, she only made it to the 3rd year. She is a victim of the test site. She has been sick since her childhood. We have shown her to different doctors, but she never left home after she finished the 3rd year at school.
Kazakh authorities estimate up to 1.5 million people were exposed to residual radioactive fallout during testing. Over 1 million received certificates confirming their status as victims of tests, making them eligible for a $40 monthly payout. Today, radiation meters are still buzzing, and much of the territory is still considered too contaminated to inhabit or cultivate. Many proliferation experts believe a resumption of testing by either nuclear superpower is unlikely anytime soon. But tensions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine have led to an increasingly hostile rhetoric. In early November, President Vladimir Putin revoked Russia's ratification of the global treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. Moscow says it will not lead to a resumption of testing unless the United States does it first.
Increasing numbers of Rohingya refugees arriving in rickety boats have caused tensions in Aceh province in western Indonesia. The country's initial welcome to Rohingya refugees, a Muslim minority who fled from Myanmar, slowly is wearing thin.
Relief after 14 days at sea. Together with some 200 other Rohingya migrants, Shahid and his family have just arrived in Aceh, Indonesia's most western province. They are now being held in a temporary shelter in PD, not far from where their boat landed.
When I was on the boat, it was pouring with rain. The wind was blowing hard too. Everyone got wet. When the sun came out, our clothes got dry. It went on like that, over and over again. I was afraid the boat would sink. I just prayed that we could land somewhere.
The Rohingyas are a Muslim minority who fled from Myanmar to neighboring Bangladesh. Shahid and his family arrived in a Bangladesh camp 11 years ago. But the conditions in the camp were becoming so inhumane that Shahid's mother and her 3 sons risked the perilous crossing to Indonesia, a journey that almost cost them their lives.
If we had stayed on that boat for another 1 or 2 days, my children would probably have died. We hadn't eaten anything for 10 days. I prayed to God that if somebody had to die, let it be me, not my children.
Until now, the people of Aceh have mostly welcomed Rohingya refugees. But recently, the number of arrivals has risen dramatically, increasing tensions in the region. This boat at Biren Beach, carrying hundreds of migrants, was pushed back to sea twice before finally being allowed to land after a 3rd attempt.
Yes, I hope they go back to their own country. I don't want them to move to other parts of Aceh. We hope the local government or central government can guard the sea so that the Rohingya that want to enter Aceh are not left unescorted.
Back at the PD shelter, some 140 kilometers away, Shahid's mother and her sons are hoping the local government will let them and their fellow refugees stay. As night falls, the local fishermen report that another 2 boats were spotted at sea.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has assured that the recent surge in respiratory illnesses in the country is a shared global concern, but Chinese authorities have it well contained. Despite concerns, a World Health Organization official clarified that the current spike in illnesses in China is not as severe as seen during the COVID-19 era. Furthermore, they emphasized that no new or unusual pathogens have been identified in recent cases.
中国有非常健全的医疗体系。那么，最近发生了一些个别地方发生一些儿童的感冒的事件，这其实在任何国家都会发生，而在中国处在有效的管控之下。
A German court has ruled that the reallocation of 60 billion euros leftover emergency funds from the COVID pandemic to green projects and industry subsidies is illegal. The government needs to take urgent action as the huge gaping hole in its budget could spell difficulties for 2024.
Winter came early this year, and while ordinary Germans grapple with the pitfalls, its government too faces a slippery slope. It all started here with a verdict from Germany's constitutional court a couple of weeks ago that called the country's finances into question. The government had moved leftover emergency funds from the COVID-19 pandemic to a fund to counter climate change. The court ruled that was illegal. Why? When Angela Merkel was in power, Germany introduced the so-called debt brake. It is enshrined in the constitution and limits how much government can borrow. It can only be suspended in emergencies, such as the pandemic. The verdict left a gaping hole worth 60 billion euros in the government's budget. Bad news for an already weakening economy.
Losing the 60 billion euros in the climate fund will result in an expected drop of around half a percentage point in growth next year. This will continue into 2025 and 2026.
It's also bad news for some of the government's biggest plans. The money had been allocated to semiconductor and battery factories, solar farms and even trains. And half of it has already been spent. So the government needed to take emergency action.
So for 2023, the debt brake has now been suspended, which means the borrowing limit has been suspended and the government could borrow more.
It's not clear yet what will happen in 2024, but it could spell a hard winter ahead for the governing coalition.
As a result of climate change, mosquitoes carrying dengue fever are spreading. Now, scientists in Indonesia have found that infecting them with a naturally occurring bacteria prevents the transmission of the disease.
It's just a small plastic bucket, but it can make a big difference. In Yogyakarta, in central Java, residents are preparing to release tens of thousands of mosquitoes right next to their homes. Professor Adi Utarini has been involved in the fight against dengue fever for over a decade. She has specialized in fighting mosquitoes with mosquitoes.
We release both male and female mosquitoes with about the same proportion, so equal proportion, with the thinking that if we release male and female mosquitoes, then once they are in the natural habitat, they could mate with the mosquitoes in the population.
Researchers discovered that mosquitoes infected with Wolbachia, a widespread and harmless bacteria, can no longer transmit the dangerous dengue virus. Once introduced into a mosquito population, the bacteria-infected type gradually replaces the native species. The good news is that the bacteria not only blocks the dengue viruses from replicating in their host, but scientists believe the bacteria can be used to combat other mosquito-borne diseases, such as Zika and yellow fever.
One of these mosquitoes lays about 100 eggs, so from a box like this, the scientists can harvest up to 1,000 eggs, and they're ready to hatch from a few days to several months after being laid.
Yogyakarta used to be a constant hotspot for dengue outbreaks, and it is particularly children, like this little boy, who are at risk. But after 3 years, a controlled trial found that dengue cases in treated areas decreased by 77%. Now the trial will be expanded to include Yogyakarta's surrounding provinces. Winning the support of local residents has been key.
Initially, the community was full of questions. Why are mosquito larvae kept next to us? The result is that more mosquitoes now enter our houses. But the good news is that we can kill the ones that get in.
The release of Wolbachia mosquitoes in Yogyakarta began after 2 years of collaboration with communities and approval from the provincial government. There are millions of dengue cases in Indonesia every year. A little white bucket could help change that.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is travelling to Dubai starting today to attend the World Climate Action Summit. This summit is the high-level segment of the 28th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC provides a unique opportunity to impart momentum for collective action towards combating the shared challenge of climate change. Now, during COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, the Prime Minister had announced 5 specific targets titled Panchamrit as India's unprecedented contribution to climate action. The PM also announced Mission Lifestyle for Environment or LIFE on that occasion. Climate change has been an important priority area of India's G20 presidency, and significant new steps have been captured in the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration and their outcomes during India's presidency. During his visit, Prime Minister Modi will also hold bilateral talks with some of the leaders participating in this summit.
In terms of Prime Minister's participation at the COP28, Honorable Prime Minister will deliver his address at the opening session of the World Climate Action Summit. Besides his address to the COP28, Prime Minister will also be participating in 3 high-level side events, of which 2 are being co-hosted by India. The first high-level event, which is being co-hosted by India and the UAE, is the launch of Green Credits Initiative. If you would recall, this was something which was rolled out earlier this month or late last month by the Ministry of Environment in India. The Green Credits Initiative is based on the Green Credit Program, which was notified by the Ministry of Environment in October this year, and basically envisions the issue of green credits for plantations on waste and degraded lands and the river catchment areas in order to restore their vitality. The second event, which is co-hosted by India and Sweden, is the launch of Lead IT 2.0, Leadership Group for Industry Transition 2.0. This, you would recall, was a joint initiative launched by India and Sweden in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Essentially, this initiative fosters collaboration among the decision makers, bringing together both the public sector and the private sector with the objective of accelerating the industry transition to net zero emissions, essentially from heavy industries.
At COP28 in Dubai, nearly 200 nations will converge, each with their unique agenda. Here's a look at the key players and their respective objectives.
Each country has its own agenda for the nearly 200 nations gathering at COP28 in Dubai. And finding consensus is a challenge, as UN climate negotiations need unanimous support to pass. Here are some of the climate summit's main players and what they're looking for. China, the world leader in both clean and dirty energy. It's responsible for 30% of annual global emissions, making it the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter. But it also has more renewable energy capacity than anywhere else. China has been feeling the impacts of climate change through heat waves, floods, and extreme drought. Despite having the world's second largest economy after the US, it sees itself as a developing nation in climate talks and argues wealthy, developed nations like the US should move first and fastest in policy and finance. It's part of the bloc of basic countries alongside South Africa, Brazil, and India, who argue the same. The United States is the world's second largest emitter. It comes to COP28 a year into rolling out a $369 billion plus subsidy package for electric vehicles and other green products. Its Inflation Reduction Act is expected to triple the country's clean energy capacity by 2030. But U.S. delegates will face pressure at COP28 after Washington pledged no new climate cash to the United Nations this year. It supports a COP28 deal to phase out CO2-emitting fossil fuel use, despite being the world's biggest oil and gas producer. The 27-country European Union is among the most ambitious. The bloc, along with the US, is pushing to triple renewable capacity. It also aims to end new coal-fueled power plants, phase out fossil fuels, and power electricity grids with renewable sources in the 2030s. African countries are pushing for climate finance to speed up green energy projects. But not everyone's on the same page. Some, like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Senegal, have backed calls for phasing out fossil fuel production. Others, like Mozambique, want to develop their reserve of gas to capitalize off European gas demands. But they do agree that any deal on phasing out fossil fuels must allow poor nations to develop reserves in the short term to alleviate energy poverty.
Delegates at this year's UN COP28 Climate Summit are eager to enhance the global climate change agenda by devising concrete strategies to tackle the second most prevalent greenhouse gas, methane.
COP28 is putting a spotlight on methane, the world's second most prominent greenhouse gas. While it has more warming potential than carbon dioxide, methane also breaks down in the atmosphere faster, meaning reining in emissions could have a more immediate impact in limiting climate change. What is needed now is to turn pledges into urgent action, according to the United Arab Emirates COP28 presidency. Here's what you need to know. More than 150 countries signed onto the US and EU-led Global Methane Pledge in 2021. They promised to slash their methane emissions 30% below 2020 levels by the end of the decade. Few have detailed how they will achieve this. The EU has agreed to set methane emission limits on Europe's oil and gas imports from 2030. The US is finalizing its own rules. Canada, meanwhile, is expected to target the sector with a proposal requiring a 70% cut in methane emissions by 2030, sources told Reuters. China, the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, has pledged to include methane in the country's 2035 National Climate Plan. The World Bank is in the process of launching a new fund, with backing from independent oil companies, among others. It would sponsor detection and cleanup programs in developing countries. Some oil and gas companies are already participating in voluntary programs to monitor or reduce their emissions. COP28 host, the United Arab Emirates, wants to see national regulations over methane-emitting sectors and financial support for developing countries. It is also calling on the oil and gas industry to phase out its methane emissions by 2030. Climate experts say getting companies and countries to commit to a binding agreement is key. Last year's methane emissions from the energy industry were slightly higher than the year before.
An expert recently emphasized that Australia has the capacity to significantly mitigate future damages caused by climate change. Authorities cautioned about an elevated risk of summer bushfires, attributing it to the anticipated El Nino weather pattern, which is set to bring hotter and drier conditions to extensive areas of the country. In September, Australia endured a formidable spring heat wave, triggering numerous bushfires. Authorities responded by imposing a fire ban in Sydney. However, recent rainfall in the eastern regions have helped quell many of the fires.
Well, we've been watching events around the world this year. 2023 is almost certain to be the hottest year on record, and we've seen this terrifying run of severe fire seasons, extreme heat waves, also devastating floods, sometimes straight off the back of extreme heats. We are now looking at potentially a very challenging summer ourselves. Everything we see now is happening in the context of climate change on a planet that is now hotter and more volatile due to the burning of coal, oil and gas. Now, Australia, as everyone knows, we've already faced severe fire seasons, extreme heat waves. We're now seeing a lot of that really supercharged against this backdrop of climate change. Good news is there's so much we can still do to limit future harms, but it means really driving down our emissions this decade and learning how to look after each other in the face of these challenges.
Well, with that, it's a wrap. Thanks so much for watching.